It's 9 o'clock and this is Sky News. Welcome to the show where I interview people who have something to say about the world today and how it's changing. They'll be from politics, sport, business, entertainment, public life, or they'll be everyday people caught up in the events of our times. And tonight, I'll be putting my questions to the Kremlin in a special interview with the Russian ambassador to the European Union. Good evening. Stalemate in Ukraine, lasting months, maybe years. That's what we're told is now likely. And with each passing day, more stories of the innocent victims. Atrocity seems to follow atrocity, each one crying for a justice that may never come. NATO has just become stronger after Finland announced its intention to join, and Sweden may follow soon. And why? Because Russia's invaded Ukraine, starting a conflict in Europe not seen since the Second World War. What's Russia's plan? Does it even have one? I'll be asking one of Russia's most senior diplomats, its ambassador to the European Union. And that war is putting further strain on a cost of living crisis now affecting millions of us. The government promises to help families in need, but do these words mean anything to those living in appalling housing conditions? One 23-year-old student campaigns for communities at the mercy of unscrupulous landlords. Kwajo Tweneboa is name-checked by ministers and celebrated by communities, but he tells us there's a long way to go yet. Also ahead, what's it like to be a mafia boss? Michael Franzese was a made man. Now, after years of jail and violence, he's turned his back on organised crime and seeks to stop others making the mistakes he did. Will his message work, or are all complicit in the glamour of the mobster's life? When and how will the war in Ukraine end? Is it a problem requiring a solution, or is it now simply a conflict leading one day to an outcome? All latest analysis says this is now likely to be a long and gruelling war. In response, previously non-aligned countries like Finland and Sweden are making moves to join NATO. But Russia is facing heavy losses in Ukraine. So did it make a grave miscalculation? Just before we came on air, I spoke to one of the most senior figures in the Russian diplomatic service, the country's ambassador to the EU. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Let's kick off. Vladimir Chizhov, you are Russia's man in Europe, and you're here to talk to us today about the situation in Ukraine. But I want to kick off with this. Can we really believe anything you say? And the reason I ask you this is that you toured the world's media not long ago, and in interview after interview, you assured the world that the invasion of Ukraine wasn't going to happen. And I've got lots of examples. Here's a couple. This is CNBC on the 21st of January. You said, you were asked that President Biden says you're going to invade Ukraine. You said there was no evidence pointing to that. That's not your aim, you were asked. Certainly not, you said. And then another one, the German newspaper Die Welt on February the 16th. This was a week before the invasion. You said, as far as Russia's concerned, I can assure you there will be no attack this Wednesday. And you then went on to say no escalation in the coming week either, or in the week after that, or in the coming months. That was a week before the invasion of Ukraine. Ambassador, did you say those things because you were lying, or did you not know the truth? You didn't realise that the invasion was imminent?
Well, as you quote, I was referring to the fact that a military operation in the territory of Ukraine was not among the aims of the Russian Federation at that point. Secondly, on the 16th of February, actually I believe I was speaking on the 15th, but never mind. I was saying that most of the recent wars in Europe, none was started on a Wednesday, and I proved correct. Nothing happened on the 16th, and nothing happened the following Wednesday, the 23rd.
You said no
As far
escalation
as
in the coming...
subsequent period, yes. As far as the following period is concerned, let me give you a picture, a broader picture of events of that period, and refer you to the 7th of February, if my memory doesn't fail me. That was the date when President Zelensky spoke to the Munich Security Conference in Munich. Yes, the 7th of February. And he actually complained that Ukraine was lacking nuclear weapons, and that he was hoping that Ukraine would get nuclear weapons in the nearest future. And the whole audience, I will remind you, including leaders of many Western countries, warmly applauded to this blatant expression of the desire to violate the international treaty on non-proliferation
that was February the 7th, and on February the 15th or 16th, you said there would be no escalation in the coming week either, or in the week after that, or in the coming months. That turned out not to be true. I just want to put that on record there because it frames the interview in that Russia repeatedly said it wouldn't invade Ukraine when those troops were massing on the borders, and that is not what happened. That invasion did occur. But let's move on to where we are now, sir. When we talk about the situation now, the US's director of the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency said this week, the Russians aren't winning, the Ukrainians aren't winning, we're at a bit of a stalemate. Is that your reading too, that there is a stalemate here? And how long do you think this conflict could last?
Well, I must admit I'm not a military expert, of course, and I cannot claim that I have the full picture on the ground of what's happening, but I can assure you that the special military operation that Russia launched on the 24th of February is proceeding according to schedule. It is not as quick as some people would have wanted in Russia. It is continuing at a certain speed, having in mind the various aspects of the situation in Ukraine, including the need to protect the troops, the Russian troops, and the allies of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, as well as the civilian population. Had the Russian army followed the pattern of the United States and other Western countries, we would have steamrolled Ukraine several times by now. But that was never the intention. Actually, I should repeat that it was not the intention of Russia to capture territory in Ukraine. It is an operation aimed at providing security for the Donbas People's Republics, as well as demilitarizing and denazification of Ukraine, in order to exclude a repetition of aggressive attempts on the part of the Kiev regime against Donbas.
Mr. Ambassador, let's break that down a bit. You said it's not proceeding as fast as some people would have wanted. Does that include President Putin? It's not quite gone according to his plan?
Actually, from what I know, the operation is proceeding in full accordance to his plan. Otherwise, you will have to ask him. OK. Well, if you could please pass on a request for an interview, I'd appreciate that.
Just in terms of, you said it's proceeding according to schedule. You did encircle Kyiv, and then you withdrew the troops to focus on the Donbass region. Lots of people would argue that this invasion has actually been a story of failure, that Russia has failed to take Kyiv, to take Kherson, to take Lviv or any other city, even to take Mariupol, despite your best efforts. You failed to keep your Black Sea Fleet intact, the sinking of the Moskva, to divide the West. You failed on that. You failed to leverage Europe's dependence on your fuel and to keep NATO at bay. I would argue, or put it to you, that if that's proceeding according to schedule, I wouldn't like to see it when it goes wrong for Russia.
Well, I believe you shouldn't be jumping to conclusions. Actually, it was never the intention of the Russian armed forces to capture Kyiv or Kharkov or any other big city. The activity of the armed forces was concentrated.
Why did you encircle Kyiv if you didn't intend to capture it, sir?
Actually, the actions undertaken at that initial stage of the operation were focused on destroying military installations like anti-aircraft systems, like airfields and depots of ammunition and armaments, and that was successful.
OK. Ambassador, just in terms of other parts of the plan, our correspondent Alex Rossi is in Ukraine. He's been in villages near Kharkiv where Russian forces have just recently left and has found clear evidence of civilians being killed and a trail of devastation. Every day we see reports of the same. Was that in the plan as well, to attack civilians?
It was never the plan to attack civilians, and civilians were never attacked. The fact that similar stories are repeated on a regular basis actually speaks of lack of imagination on the organizers of those provocations, like in Bucha and other places.
Mr. Ambassador, just to be clear, that the evidence is being gathered by my colleague. It's not coming from the Ukrainians. He is actually physically on the ground in those villages near Kharkiv.
Well, I must admit that tragic events are happening. Civilians are dying, but not at the hands of the Russian armed forces. I'm sure your colleague has not seen Russian soldiers shooting at civilians.
Well, there have been some reports today of filming of Russian soldiers shooting civilians, but I'd like to come on to that later, actually, with you. What I actually would like to bring you to, Mr. Ambassador, is you are the man in Europe. I want to talk to you about Finland and Sweden, EU countries this week who have made moves to join NATO. What is your response to this?
Well, I'm deeply disappointed and saddened by those decisions. You know, Finland is not a very big country in terms of population. It's about 5 million or something like that. But it has successfully been pushing above its weight, having become in the last few decades a major power in terms of promoting European security architecture. We all remember the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, the OSCE, which started as the CSE, the conference in Helsinki, the Finnish capital. And actually, this punching above its weight was a matter of general respect for Finland and its neutral policy. Why the current Finnish government has chosen to turn the country into a backwater periphery of NATO, I cannot understand.
So if Finland is a member of NATO, does that make a Russian attack on Finland more or less likely, sir?
No, but as my government has pointed out, this will necessitate certain military technical measures, like improving or raising the degree of defense preparations along the Finnish border. And the Russian-Finnish border is more than 1,300 kilometers, I should remind you.
Mr. Ambassador, what does that mean, military technical measures along the border? What does that mean? Troops along the border, tanks along the border? I don't understand what that is.
Not necessarily troops and tanks, but certain preparations, definitely, yes. Like radars, perhaps. But again, I'm not a military expert to judge on those technicalities.
Mr. Ambassador, have you decided to come on the show and do an interview tonight because you're here to warn of the risk of this conflict escalating into a wider European war? Is that your message tonight?
Indeed. And actually, the issue that we just referred to, NATO expansion in the, shall I say, northeastern direction, is another element to that.
So you're saying that the expansion of NATO into other European Union countries and other European states could prompt military retaliation from Russia? Is it just words of warning? What is it?
Well, it will certainly necessitate certain rethinking of the Russian defense posture. And what we are particularly worried these days is, of course, that while speaking about the need for the Ukrainian conflict to come to an end, Western leaders, including leaders of the European Union, I should point out, are saying that the fate of this conflict will be resolved on the battlefield. So the European Union had
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think
do.
actually I find that in all the interviews I've done with...
You're interrupting me all the time.
I'm sorry, sir, but what I hear from Western leaders is they would like a peaceful, negotiated settlement.
Then why are they pumping weapons into Ukraine at an increasing speed? That will certainly not help, unless they, of course, want to fight this war until the last living Ukrainian.
And, Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, let's just move on to sort of possible escalation. In terms of nuclear threat, can you explain what President Putin meant when he said this? I have a direct quote from him. This is from April the 27th. I'm sure you know it. He said, if anyone decides to meddle in ongoing events and create unacceptable strategic threats for Russia, they must know our response will be lightning quick. We have all the instruments for this, ones nobody else can boast of, and we will use them if we have to. Is there a possibility of nuclear escalation, sir?
Well, actually, that quotation that you just cited doesn't include the word nuclear. But let me say that the Russian military doctrine outlines very specifically the situations when Russia may actually proceed with the use of nuclear weapons. It's an open document. You can read it.
Is that getting more or less likely as time goes on?
That depends on the others.
Can you reassure us that regardless of what happens, that nuclear weapons won't be deployed in Ukraine, that actually this is about NATO and the threat from NATO as you perceive it?
You mean whether NATO will deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine? I hope not.
Whether Russia would deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine or on Ukraine?
Why should Russia deploy? Actually, as distinctively different from the United States, Russia does not deploy nuclear weapons anywhere beyond its own national territory.
Let me bring you on to the issue of war crimes. The International Criminal Court has just announced an investigation on the back of growing evidence. Will Russia cooperate in that investigation?
I don't think so, because actually neither Russia nor Ukraine are members of that particular court, which has a very, I would say, doubtful reputation.
OK, you don't recognise the International Criminal Court. Do you recognise the jurisdictions of other international bodies, such as the International Court of Justice? They called on Russia to immediately suspend military operations on March the 16th. The UN Human Rights Council, which has formed an international committee of inquiry on Ukraine to investigate Russian breaches of law. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission says it's recorded instances of Russia using cluster munitions attacking hospitals. And the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe on April the 13th, they said the attack on Mariupol Hospital was a deliberate war crime. Do you recognise any of those bodies, or are all those organisations wrong?
Well, let me start my reply with a question from my part. Where were all those international institutions for the last 8 years when the Ukrainian army and the nationalist battalions were waging a terrible campaign against Donbass? When a lot of people suffered, more than 14,000 people died at the hands of the Ukrainian army.
Well,
not a single of those organizations has even said a word about that.
Well, Ambassador,
and
if you participated...
was a fake, it was a provocation.
Ambassador, I've just put the point to you that if you participate, then the alleged war crimes you talk about could also be investigated by those international bodies. But look, we're running out of time, and I would just like to ask you, because I think people would like to know, do you think that we can get to an eventual negotiated outcome in Ukraine, and what might that look like from a Russian perspective?
Well, on a positive note, I'm sure we will come to a negotiated solution of the Ukrainian crisis. When that will happen, I will not try to speculate. And how that final solution will look like in detail, nobody knows. But in principle, it will mean that Ukraine will be a neutral state, non-aligned, without any foreign military presence in its territory, that Ukraine will have recognized the Donbas republics and, of course, the reunification of Crimea with the Russian Federation.
Okay.
And the rest we'll see in detail.
So, Abbas, just to be clear, your vision of an independent Ukraine would be the Donbass would be returned to Russia. There would be a land bridge to the Black Sea connecting Crimea, and Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO, nor would it be allowed to join the European Union. Are they your terms for peace?
Donbass is actually consists of primarily two independent countries that have been recognized as such by the Russian Federation. The Donbas People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. Their territory will most probably be the territory of the former Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine. And due to the fact that Russia has recognized them and actually established diplomatic relations with them, they even have opened up embassies in Moscow.
But just finally, how do you think it's going to end? Do you think this will go on for a number of years?
Well, if you allow me a personal warning to the West, before you burn all the bridges with Russia, think of the day after, that we will have to rebuild our relations on a new basis. There will be no return to business as usual. The world is changing before our eyes. And as soon as the collective West, to use the present-day phraseology, as soon as the collective West understands that Russia is a country whose interests should be reckoned with, and the current multipolar world, which is not limited to the West and Russia. It's a big world besides Europe, North America, and Russia. And if you look at the situation on a global scale, you will see that a lot of countries, they may not be very outspoken these days, but they share the global view of my country.
OK, Mr Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
The Russian ambassador to the EU there. And if you scan this QR code on the screen now, which you can see, you can watch all of our interviews online and all of the previous episodes of the show. Well, stay with us, because coming up next, we'll be speaking to Kwajo Tweneboa, whose social media campaign is changing housing conditions for thousands of people in the UK. Welcome back. At 23 years old, Kwajo Tweneboa has already become something of a hero for renters in the UK. His social media campaign forced one of Europe's largest housing associations to take direct action and fix the conditions people were living in. His campaigning, followed by nearly 50,000 people on Twitter, has since been recognised by the government, who has vowed to name and shame landlords who breach standards. He told me of his personal story with social housing. Kwajo, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you.
And you're here because you've become a very, very well-known figure for your campaigning work around housing and the fight for better housing for your own family and also countless other people. And I'm going to bring some videos in a bit about some of your campaigning material, but I wanted to start with you and your story.
Yeah.
So can you talk me through your own story, your own experience, and tell me a bit about what happened to your family?
Yeah, so I've lived in social housing for the majority of my life, and disrepair's been a huge part of that. I lived in temporary accommodation many times, and one of which was a converted car garage, which was falling apart. There was damp, there was mould, somewhere where no one should be living. I then, with my dad and my two sisters, moved to my current home now, which, again, was completely falling apart, but we just took it in the end because it was permanent social housing. So my dad didn't really have an option because he had been waiting for years and years for that. And that was completely falling apart again. Damp, mould, cockroaches, no kitchen, no bathroom, mice. Yeah.
So when you were a little boy, your dad was waiting to get a permanent home for you on a council waiting list.
Yeah.
And you just kept being moved around.
Exactly, yeah. And there was a feeling, especially for him, that he didn't want to complain. So although the place was falling apart in the temporary accommodation especially, because it was temporary accommodation, there's this huge fear, and not just with him, but other tenants that I've spoken to, that if they do complain, they're at risk.
And your dad was a care worker, wasn't he?
He was, yes. He looked after the elderly.
Yeah. So your dad had a very valuable job to his community.
Yeah.
But he couldn't get social housing for him and his family.
No, and he had done that for many years, decades, looking after the elderly. So he was essentially a key worker. Although it wasn't referred to that back then, he was. And it was a struggle. I mean, we saw it as children at the time, how hard it was for him.
And tell me about your dad.
Oh, yeah, well, he's no longer here. He fell ill while we were living in my current property now, while it was falling apart. So, like I described, damp, mould, cockroaches, and he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, stage 1. that rapidly progressed to stage 4. But meanwhile, he was receiving medical treatment, so he was being fed through his stomach during that time, and he was bedbound. He couldn't move, all whilst there was cockroaches and mice in the property, just somewhere where no one should have been living, never mind someone receiving medical treatment for such a serious illness. So he then passed away in January 2020, and the fight continued in regards to the poor housing that we was living in.
Well, I'm sorry you lost your dad.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's rough. But your dad being ill in these housing conditions, was that the trigger for you? Is that when you started the campaigning, or had you started that before?
I think so. Whilst my dad was ill, that was the sort of main concern. I mean, housing was parked to the side because it was just about trying to get him better, and we thought he would. But then when he passed away, and I looked back in hindsight, I realised this was just completely unacceptable. How is it not illegal? And he was the sort of fire that I needed, and it's carried me up until today, because I'm very, very determined that no one should be living in these conditions, never mind people receiving medical treatment, but it's happened time and time again, and I've seen it. So he's very much the driving force behind
your dad's the fire that drives you on.
Keep burning,
And I imagine he'd be incredibly proud of you. You fought for your own family and got much better conditions for your sisters, right? So you did that for your own family, but you also campaigned for other people. And I think we have some footage which I was watching actually last night. It's all on your Twitter feed. Let's have a look at, this is someone else's house.
Here you can see a cockroach alive in the water still. Well, it's just, it's still alive now. And I wasn't recording, but remind me, so you've got 3 kids?
Yeah.
And what's the youngest? How old's the youngest?
4.
4, and then it's a 12-year-old.
And 10.
And a 10-year-old. And you said your youngest has even fallen in the house because of the... Because of the leak. And that's your landline cable there.
Yeah.
That they've come to make safe. And where your washing machine's supposed to be plugged in, it's not working at all.
Safe.
So there you've got black rot, you've got cockroaches. You told me that mum found a cockroach in her ear. Yeah, a few days before I went there, when I did go there, she mentioned after I'd pulled back the child's mattress and hundreds of cockroaches came crawling out, she said she often finds them burrowed in her ears in the morning and had to have a few removed. I mean, it's absolutely slum conditions that no one should be allowed to live in. But they are, unfortunately. What happened to that family? Have you managed to get... Yeah, so I highlighted the case on social media and they were moved out within 24 hours. They were put into a hotel, but I found out about 2 days ago that they will be moved into permanent accommodation in the next 2 weeks, and it will be completely disrepair free. Great. So I'm glad that's happened. So that feels good, huh? Yeah, that's why I do it. That's why I... Let's go on to your politics or your political influence, because you, at how old? 23 years old, were name-checked by no other than the Secretary of State for Levelling Up and Housing, Michael Gove, this week. How do you view that acclaim from politicians for what you do? Well, all I feel is that it's about time. So when I'm meeting people like Michael Gove and other politicians, it's not a sense... it's nice to meet them. I mean, having grown up in my background and seen them on TV, it is nice to meet them. But I mean, the context that I'm meeting them in isn't great. The reason I'm meeting them is to highlight a national crisis, I think, that's happening. And I've managed to build a platform where I can now hold not just housing associations and social housing providers accountable, but also politicians that don't, unfortunately, do as much as they need to be doing to help people. Do you feel cross with him when you see him, given that it's the Conservative Party that have been in power for 12 years? I mean, do you blame him? Yes, I'd say I blame the government that's been in power for the last decade, because this is something that has been complained about time and time again, but it's never, unfortunately, been seen as priority. This isn't something that's been happening for a year. This has been going on for absolute decades, and unfortunately, for the last 10 years or 12 years, it's got progressively worse. And after Grenfell, you would expect, and you would have expected, for this to be top priority in regards to regulation and social housing providers and landlords being held accountable. But unfortunately, 5 years on, they haven't been, and I think it is a national disgrace, but I'm glad that he's
acknowledge that, and it is acknowledging it and making the steps. And I think every single politician in Westminster should be screaming and shouting from the rooftops about this, because I have no doubt in every single constituency is a resident living in poor social or housing, not even just social housing conditions, in housing in general, and it shouldn't be happening, especially after Grenfell.
The UK's the 5th richest economy in the world.
Yeah.
Yet you've shown these conditions. We are a wealthy nation, a very wealthy nation. You've shown these conditions are commonplace. 1.6 million homes in social housing or private rented sector failed to meet the government's good home standards. Why have people been forgotten in this way? Is it cultural? Is it political? What do you think?
It's a mixture, I think, between both. And the fundamental thing is the lack of care. Like I mentioned before, it's not being seen as a priority.
Is that because people in government don't experience it?
Yeah, almost definitely. And it's, I mean, having to deal with housing is a big issue. And I mean, it's not going to be bringing in money really for them. So I understand why they don't see it as a priority, but it should, because it affects millions of people's lives. And not just that, I think it's also, when we look at Westminster and diversity, it's very easy to tick a box when it comes to race and also gender, but what's not looked at is class and the fact that there's not class diversity in Westminster. So how can they truly be representative of the people like me, people sat in their homes, suffering in social housing, and truly say that they are diverse and representative of them? Because I can tell them, frankly, they're not.
I was going to ask you this, I'll bring it up now, you've brought it up, because you're a serious campaigner, you have a national profile, you're commanding the attention of cabinets, you're 23 years old. I mean, I can't get over that, how young and influential you've become. But you're a young black man, you're a young working-class black man. I was going to ask you, what's the biggest barrier? Is it being black or is it being working class? Or is it both?
I mean, the mixture of the two just sets you on a back foot completely. I mean, there's a stigma that comes around with being a black male off of an estate. It's never a good one. You're almost looked down upon. So for me to be able to do this, I wanted to be able to show other people like me, other black boys off of an estate, that it is possible to make change and that your voice does matter, because it does. And collectively, change can be brought about. I mean, in the last year, this has happened and they've been supporting. I have to give massive thanks to the black community, especially, on my estate and on social media, that have constantly shared this and been able to relate to the situations that I've been highlighting, because for so long they've suffered, their parents have suffered, and they've just been ignored. So if I can help inspire them, then that's what I want to do with the work that I am doing, as well as creating change in government.
And you do inspire people, but you have created change in government. The Queen's speech this week, that's the government's legislative programme for the next year, contained measures to clamp down on rogue landlords, which is directly attributable to you. Is that enough? Does that go far enough for you, or is that just the beginning of this campaign for you? I
mean, it was nice hearing that in the Queen's speech, I have to say, but I want to know what exactly that entails, what changes are being brought about. I think there needs to be a crackdown on landlords, both privately and social landlords. They need to be held accountable. With the work that I've been doing over the last year, highlighting not one CEO or senior manager for one of these social housing providers has lost their jobs, but had it been a situation where this was in the NHS or any other public sector, people would have lost their jobs as a result.
You think there's not enough accountability?
There's not enough accountability, and I still don't believe there's enough care there too. And like I mentioned earlier, after Grenfell, people should be held accountable within housing and meeting or not meeting regulation.
I've got a few more questions. I've run out of time so quickly. You have made incredible impact. Do you ever see yourself being a politician? I think you did once tweet that you might try and be the Mayor of London, so you can't say that this comes from nowhere, this question.
Yes.
Would you?
I've thought about it, and I mean, for change to happen, yes, I know I'm screaming and shouting from outside, but I do believe it comes from within too. So who knows? I know the mayoral election is in 2 years. I have to wait and see.
Would you join a political party? Have you joined a political party?
I have to say I'm very disappointed in both of them at the moment, equally. So I haven't yet. Whether I will, I have to wait and see. But if I do, do anything politically, it'll probably have to be independent, the way the current political sphere looks at the moment.
OK, so you might go into politics, so you might have a look at running for London Mayor. Watch this space. Right, OK. You're also, people might not realise this, you're also actually a full-time student. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you're very productive. You're clearly not down the bar like I was when I was... You're very productive. You've just finished your exams.
I have, yesterday, 3-hour exam in the morning. So that's my degree over. And I mean, that for me was the hardest thing I think I've done, because on 4 occasions with my dad passing away and becoming ill, I did plan on dropping out. So to be able to
go and care for your sisters and sort everything out.
Exactly. And
it must have been really hard.
Yeah, so to be able to do it, that's a huge accomplishment. And I know that's one of the last things he remembered, was the fact that I'm in uni and I'm going to finish my degree, so that's
Were you the first person from your family to go to university? I
was, but me and my sister are both graduating this year.
Wow, so. He must have been so proud of you all.
Yeah.
So you're going to get a business studies degree. You said that you're hoping to get a 2-1. I think you might get a first. I think there might be some false modesty there. Or not, well, not just genuine modesty, actually. But you've got an ambition to be an artist.
Yes, that's always been my main goal. I mean, from the age of 14, I taught myself how to paint portraits. So I've been doing that on the side while studying my degree and everything else, and that's what I hope to go back into. I mean, long term, that is what I want to do. When
it comes to your campaign on housing, how do you define success? What would it be for you? You think, I've done it?
Success for me would be when my phone stops going off from tenants complaining that they've been ignored constantly and asking for my help as a result.
OK. Kwajo, thanks so much for coming and joining us on the show.
Thank you so much.
It's great talking to you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Kwajo there, he's just 23 years old. Well, Goodfellas, The Godfather. For years, Hollywood's been making films about mafia families. Well, tonight we have a real-life member. Michael Franzese is a former member of the New York Colombo crime family. He's now in the UK, holding a series of events and visiting prisons and community centres to tell his story. And I spoke to him a little earlier. Michael, thanks for coming on the show. Let's kick off with your past. You were once a mafia boss. In 1986, you were actually listed as one of the top 50 most powerful and wealthy mafia bosses in the world. There's a mystique, in a way, around the mafia, a sort of glamour and grit. Are the portrayals that we see anything like living it?
Well, it depends on what you're seeing. And if you're watching a movie like Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, even Bronx Tale, pretty authentic. You know, the characters are portrayed well. And, you know, in Goodfellas, they mentioned me in Goodfellas, and in Donnie Brasco. I knew all those guys, and I thought they did a great job. Now, some of the movies that you see, no. But those 3, I would say, are pretty accurate.
When I watched Gomorrah, which is set in Italy, it's set in the slums of Naples, really. It's gritty and it's messy and it's brutish and it's a kind of horrible life, actually, to watch it. It's full of pathos, actually. Was it like that quite a lot of the time, like it was a grind?
In America, there are a lot of misconceptions, you know, that people draw from the media and sometimes from, you know, from entertainment things that they watch. There is a gritty part of the life, obviously. It's very gritty, it's street. But there's also a integrity and a respect to the life. And I think we see that in some of those movies. We saw it in The Godfather, even though it was fictional. And that's what I experienced, you know. There is a high standard in that life in many ways.
There's a code of conduct.
Yeah, code of conduct. Respect is an issue. Discipline is an issue. You know, being respectful to women, believe it or not, you know, your wives, your families. It's all part of that life, and there are serious consequences if you don't pay attention.
On your website, you say of yourself that you're the only high-ranking official from a major crime family that ever walked away without protective custody alive, and you're still here, and you're very successful.
Yes.
How did you do that?
Well, understand, it's not something that I portrayed myself as, but you don't walk away from that life. I mean, you just can't. You take that oath, it's a lifetime oath. And normally when people leave the life, they join the government, enter a witness protection program, and begin cooperating. I didn't do that. I was just determined to walk away because I knew it was a bad life, and I wanted to preserve my family life.
After you left, you must have been afraid. Were you constantly looking over your shoulder thinking someone's going to take me out?
When I walk down the street here, I look over my shoulder. It's just instinct, you know, from being part of that life for so many years. I didn't live in fear because I felt pretty sure that I can handle it. So I didn't live in fear, but I was cautious.
I wondered as well whether your father remained in the Mafia. He died when we just talked about it, when he was 103. Did he offer you protection? Do you think that helped you, that your father was still active?
You know, yes and no. Listen, when I walked away from that life, the authorities, the FBI, came into prison. I was in prison at the time, and they said, there's a contract on your life and your father has gone along with it. That's what they told me. You know, I don't think they understood that I knew the life that well, and I understood that my father couldn't speak up for me at that point because he didn't know what I was going to do. If he did go along with it, it was only to protect himself, because when you bring somebody into that life and that person becomes an informant or cooperator, you could be in trouble yourself for introducing him into the life.
How did you feel when you found out that your father had gone along with the contract on your life? You're a father yourself.
I understood what he was doing. Now, I want to make it clear, I mean, I don't think my father would ever put a bullet in my head. I don't believe that. He did what he had to do just to preserve himself at that point, but did it hurt a little bit? Yeah, I have to admit it did, but I understood what he was doing, and I love my dad. I mean, there was nothing that he was going to do to interfere in the love that I had for him and the love he had for me. I understood that. But, you know, the street life is different, and you have to be careful there because, you know, one wrong move could be very serious.
So in some ways, the Mafia family becomes more important than your nuclear family, your real family?
Not for me, but remember this.
But for your dad?
Yes, when you take that oath, you're told straight out, if your mother is dying and sick and you're at her bedside and we call you to service, you leave your mother, you come and serve us. From now on, we're number one in your life before anything and everything. So you have that drilled into your head. It's number one. My dad, unfortunately, lived by that oath to great suffering of his family. I mean, I understand. I had a sister that died at the age of 27, OD'd on drugs. My brother, a drug addict all his life, became an informant and testified against my dad in a case. My younger brother, my baby brother.
What happened to him?
He put my father back in jail. My brother is now on the street. He was in witness protection for many years. And I wasn't willing to do that to my family.
Michael, can you a made man, a made member, you were inducted in 1975,
yes.
so
Yes.
48 years ago it would be, 47 years ago. Can you just explain to the viewers what is that? What was that night like? What happens?
They cut your finger right here, some blood drops on the floor. I cupped my hands. They took a picture of a saint, Catholic altar card, put it on my hands, lit it aflame. Didn't hurt, it burned quickly. It was merely symbolic. And he said, tonight, Michael Franzese, you are born again into a new life, into Cosa Nostra. Violate what you know about this life, betray your brothers, and you will die and burn in hell like the saint is burning in your hands. Do you accept? Yes, I do. That's the oath.
Well, let's get on to London, here in Tottenham. You came here to talk about the tour, but also you know in London that there's a huge problem with knife crime in places like Tottenham, lots of boroughs across the capital. There's an initiative here, gloves up, knives down. Would that have persuaded you years ago in Brooklyn, do you think?
Yes. These kids on the street, I spent a lot of time in prison with kids coming into the system, 21, 22 years old, horrible backgrounds, you know, get involved in gangs, drugs, the whole bit. And I used to minister and counsel to them at that time. Before I was a Christian, I was still a street guy at that point. I said, what are you doing with your life? You know, I tell them, you know, you keep hanging out in these environments, get used to this because this is going to be your home. You're going to be here for the rest of your life. And you're going to drive your family crazy if you got one. So, but yes, you need these organizations because, look, you can't just tell a kid, walk away from that life and send them back to the neighborhood. It's dangerous.
What occurs to me when you talk about your previous life is that the Mafia is like an alternative society. It has a family, it has social bonds, intergenerational respect, it has a structure, it has a code of conduct. It's motivated by a clear goal, which is success and protection of members. When I think about organised crime gangs in London, they might be less structured, but they also, for the kids that get involved in them, they're a family. It provides them with structure. Do you see parallels between the two lives?
No, they don't have real structure and discipline. They're not really organized. They're a bunch of street thugs trying to steal to earn a living, and that's what they teach. It's different. The gang life is different than Mafia, Cosa Nostra. We were organized crime. We had our crime directed in a certain direction. We weren't going robbing people's houses and you know, knifing people in the street and stuff like that. We didn't do that. My targets, federal government, big banks, insurance company. They got enough money. I figured, hey, if we take a few bucks there, they'll survive. We're not robbing people in the street. It's a whole different thing. That's not family.
And Michael, we've talked a bit about knife crime and inner city crime. And you do go and talk to kids in schools, but you're also here because you've got a tour where you're going to talk about your life.
Yes. July 2nd at the Grosvenor Hotel, we kick off the tour right here in London, where we should kick it off. And we're going to 25 cities throughout the United Kingdom. And it's going to be fantastic. I'm very excited about it. They're going to hear about the mob life. It's part of life. I know what people want to hear. I've been telling stories, but I feel I can say things here in the United Kingdom that I've never said before. And I want to give people a real insight into that life. You got to understand something. I was around John Gotti, Fat Tony Salerno, The Chin, Joe Colombo. These were all my fellow associates. My dad, Sonny Franzese, oldest living mob guy in the world. So I have a lot to talk about, a lot to tell. I want to give people real insight into that life, and they're going to hear it all around the UK. And it's going to be a fun deal.
OK, Michael Franzese, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you to all our guests, and thank you so much for watching. Coming up, the news at 10 on Sky.